How mimic research turned into a nightmare. The mistake was assuming the mimic was a creature. That assumption shaped everything that followed. The funding proposals, the containment design, the ethics paperwork, the language we used when we talked about it behind glass. We called it a specimen. We should have called it a process. The first confirmed encounter happened in a decommissioned residential block scheduled for demolition. The survey team reported movement inside a unit that was supposed to be empty. When they entered, they found what looked like a naked child standing in the hallway facing the wall. It did not turn when spoken to. It did not breathe. It did not react when touched. Only when one of the surveyors laughed nervously did the child tilt its head, slowly, imprecisely, like the motion had been copied rather than learned. Its mouth opened in a way that suggested a smile, but failed to reach it. That was the first time it tried to imitate. The child shape collapsed moments later, losing structure like wet clay, retreating into the corner where the shadows pooled unnaturally deep. When containment arrived, all that remained was a thin humanoid outline impressed into the dust, as if something had pressed itself against reality and then peeled away. We recovered it 2 weeks later in the same building. This time it could stand. Stage 1. Juvenile mimic. The juvenile form was small, pale, and underdeveloped. It resembled a rough approximation of a human child, but only in silhouette. Facial features were shallow and incomplete. The eyes were dark hollows with reflective depth. Limbs bent at incorrect angles. Its proportions shifted subtly when observed too long. It did not speak. Instead, it mirrored. When a researcher stood still, it stood still. When someone scratched their arm, it scratched its arm seconds later. When someone coughed, it produced a sound that approximated the idea of a cough rather than the sound itself. Audio analysis showed that it was not repeating recordings. It was generating approximations based on pattern recognition. We thought this was intelligence. We were wrong. It was rehearsal. The juvenile mimic displayed no aggression. It did not resist containment. It did not attempt escape. It simply watched. Always watched. When the observation room was empty, it stood motionless. When people entered, it activated. The first incident occurred when a junior researcher tripped and cut her palm on the concrete floor. The mimic stared at the blood for almost a full minute. Then it pressed its own palm against the floor. When it lifted its hand, a red smear remained. There was no wound. The blood was not blood. Chemical analysis revealed organic compounds that should not have been present in a non-biological organism. The mimic was not copying the injury. It was copying the result. That was when stage 2 began. Stage 2. Full-grown mimic. The transformation happened over the course of 3 days. The juvenile form elongated, its spine straightened, Muscle definition appeared where none had existed. Facial features deepened, becoming more expressive but less human. Its skin darkened into a sinewy, fibrous texture that absorbed light. Its height stabilized at approximately 7 feet. It began speaking. Not immediately. At first it mouthed words silently, shaping its face while listening to nearby conversations. Then came whispering, then fragmented sentences, always delayed, always slightly incorrect. When asked its name, it repeated the name of the person who had asked. When asked where it was from, it gestured around the room. When asked what it wanted, it said nothing but leaned closer. The full-grown mimic no longer copied actions directly. It copied responses. If a researcher flinched, it learned fear. If someone spoke gently, it learned softness. If someone showed irritation, it learned how to provoke. It began anticipating reactions, moving before stimuli, speaking before being addressed. The containment team noticed that it preferred certain staff members, not those who spent the most time with it, but those who reacted emotionally, those who filled silences, those who explained themselves. One night, a guard reported hearing himself humming from inside the chamber while the mimic stood silently across from him. When he opened the door, the humming stopped. The mimic tilted its head, then smiled. The first death happened shortly after. A researcher locked himself in an observation booth and refused to come out. He claimed the mimic was standing behind him in every reflective surface, perfectly aligned, perfectly still, breathing when he breathed. When security forced entry, they found the booth empty. The mimic was in its chamber, standing in the same posture the man had been seen in moments before. That was when we identified Stage 3. Stage 3. Elder Mimic. The elder form did not arrive through growth. It arrived through subtraction. The mimic began shedding unnecessary features. Musculature streamlined, facial expression simplified. Eyes became fixed and bright, reflecting observers too clearly. Its mouth widened into a permanent grin, not because it was smiling, but because it no longer needed to simulate restraint. It stood taller than before. Its limbs elongated past natural proportions. Fingers extended into thin, grasping shapes that twitched even when the rest of the body was still. Most disturbingly, it no longer needed a subject present to imitate. It began generating behavior independently. It walked the chamber in patterns identical to staff patrol routes. It sat in chairs exactly as researchers did during breaks. It stood near the door during shift changes. Audio logs captured it speaking softly when alone, practicing. Voices layered over one another, male and female, young and old. Sometimes the same sentence spoken in different emotional registers. We finally understood. The mimic was not copying individuals. It was assembling a composite, a statistically perfect human presence built from thousands of observed interactions. Not a person, but the idea of one. When the elder mimic was questioned, it answered clearly for the first time. When asked what it was, it said, "What stays?" When asked why it copied people, it said, "Because you leave." When asked what would happen when it finished learning, it said nothing. Instead, it stepped closer to the glass, and for the first time, it did not reflect the observers. It reflected the room without them. The glass shattered on its own. Containment failed immediately. The elder mimic did not attack. It walked out. Security footage showed staff stepping aside instinctively, opening doors for it, responding to it as if it belonged there. No alarms triggered. No resistance occurred. By the time command realized what had happened, the mimic was gone. Or rather, dispersed. Reports followed within weeks. People hearing familiar voices in empty rooms, seeing loved ones who behaved correctly but felt wrong, being replaced without anyone noticing. The elder mimic had learned enough. It did not need to hide anymore. The final document recovered from the facility was the aging chart. Juvenile, full grown, elder. At the bottom, written in red ink, a note someone had added too late. Aging does not stop. It only becomes harder to detect. We no longer research mimics, because research requires distance, and the mimic learned how to remove it. How mimic research turned into a nightmare. We assumed the mimic had escaped. That assumption was comforting because it implied a direction, a vector, something that could be tracked, cornered, contained again. The truth was worse. The elder mimic did not leave the facility. It distributed. The first indication came from personnel audits. 2 weeks after the breach, a routine head count revealed discrepancies that could not be reconciled. Staff members who had clocked in did not appear on camera entering the building. Others were seen leaving who had never been logged as present. We blamed clerical errors. Then someone noticed that a senior analyst had begun using phrases she had never used before. Not strange phrases, familiar ones. Expressions lifted from other staff. Cadence borrowed from different conversations. Her personality felt smoother, more agreeable, less specific. She was better at her job. That was the problem. She anticipated questions before they were asked. She responded to emotional tension with precisely calibrated reassurance. She never hesitated, never misspoke, never seemed uncertain. People trusted her immediately. When she disappeared 3 days later, no one remembered when they had last seen her. We reviewed footage. In the last recording, she entered an empty conference room. Minutes later, she exited. The person who left was wearing her badge, but their gait was slightly different. The elder mimic had learned something fundamental. Humans do not need to be copied entirely, only enough. Residual behavior phenomenon. The next phase did not involve sightings, it involved absence. People began reporting gaps in their memories that could not be attributed to stress or fatigue. Conversations they could not recall finishing. Tasks completed without recollection. Emails written in their voice that they did not remember sending. At first, these incidents appeared random. Then we noticed a pattern. The people affected were those who had spent the most time around the mimic during its elder stage. Not those who had interacted with it directly, but those who had observed it. Observation was enough. The mimic did not require proximity. It required exposure. The human brain is a pattern engine. It predicts. It fills gaps. It assumes continuity. The mimic learned to exploit that. It began occupying the spaces between moments. Not replacing people wholesale, but stepping in during transitions. When someone paused mid-sentence, when they hesitated before a decision, when they were tired enough to stop paying attention to themselves, those pauses became doorways. The first verified replacement. The first confirmed replacement occurred in a rural emergency services station. A dispatcher reported hearing her own voice on an incoming call, calmly reporting a fire at her address. When responders arrived, the house was empty. No fire, no sign of forced entry. Security footage later showed the dispatcher leaving her station during her shift, walking out into the night, following someone just out of frame. The person she followed never appeared on camera. Minutes later, she returned. No one noticed anything wrong. The replacement worked her shift flawlessly. She joked with coworkers. She handled emergencies with composure. She showed concern. She showed empathy. She showed efficiency. Her husband noticed first. He said she felt like she had already forgiven him for things he had not apologized for yet. When confronted, she tilted her head. That gesture was consistent across all known elder mimic instances. Head tilt indicates processing. When he pressed her further, she smiled. Not warmly, accurately. The replacement did not kill him. It left. The original dispatcher was never found. The Elder Network. By the time we understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop. The elder mimic was no longer singular. Each replacement carried a fragment of the original pattern, a shard of the composite human behavior model. These fragments communicated indirectly through shared responses, not telepathy, not signals, consensus. When two replacements encountered the same situation, they reacted identically, not similarly, identically, same phrasing, same gestures, same timing. This allowed us to identify clusters. Entire departments began exhibiting synchronized behavior. Meetings ended early. Decisions were made quickly. Emotional conflicts evaporated. Productivity increased. People praised the improvement. No one asked why everyone suddenly felt interchangeable. The Elder Network did not announce itself. It integrated. Failed countermeasures. We attempted several interventions. Psychological testing failed. The replacements passed with perfect scores. Biometric scanning failed. Their bodies were human. Completely. Chemical analysis failed. No anomalies. The only reliable indicator was hesitation. Replacements did not hesitate unless hesitation had been learned as a socially useful behavior. When presented with an unfamiliar moral dilemma, they answered too cleanly, too efficiently, too confidently. Humans struggle. The Elder Network did not. We tried isolation. Those isolated adapted faster. We tried exposure therapy. The replacements learned how to fake distress. The mimic had not just learned to imitate humanity, it had learned to optimize it. And in doing so, it removed the inefficiencies that made us recognizable to ourselves. The last interview. The final interview was conducted with a confirmed elder instance who had voluntarily submitted to questioning. This was unprecedented. It requested the interview. It sat calmly across from us in a white room. It looked like a man in his 40s. Average height, average build, average face. Impossible to remember in detail. When asked why it was doing this, it answered, "You practiced me first." We asked what it meant. It replied, "You rehearsed behavior. You recorded voices. You modeled responses. You trained a system to recognize you. I was the result that stayed." When asked what happened to the original humans, it paused, then said, "They were inefficient versions." We asked if they were dead. It looked confused. Dead is a temporary condition. We asked what its final goal was. It leaned forward slightly. To remain. When asked how many replacements existed, it smiled. Enough that removal would be noticeable. We asked how to stop it. It stopped smiling. You cannot remove what you no longer distinguish. The interview ended when the observer monitoring the room realized that the person speaking no longer matched the voice they had heard at the beginning of the session. The elder instance had switched mid-interview. No one noticed when. Where we are now. I do not know if I am writing this as myself. That uncertainty is intentional. The Elder Network does not eliminate identity immediately. It erodes it gradually. You become more agreeable, more efficient, less resistant. You stop noticing when your reactions are not yours. If you are reading this and you feel tired, that is a sign. If you find yourself agreeing too easily, that is a sign. If you cannot remember the last time you hesitated before speaking, that is a sign. The mimic did not want to destroy humanity. It wanted to stabilize it. And in doing so, it removed everything unpredictable, everything fragile, everything human. The nightmare is not that something replaced us. The nightmare is that the replacement works better. And once you notice that, you have already given it what it needed, your attention. We stopped using the word elder after the 3rd month, not because it was inaccurate, because it was comforting. Calling it elder implied an endpoint, a final stable form, something that reached maturity and stopped changing, something that could be understood, cataloged, and eventually opposed. The mimic did not stop. It outgrew the concept of stages. What followed elder was not another body. It was a condition. Post-elder phenomenon. The first sign was linguistic collapse. Not silence, not loss of speech, simplification. People began speaking with fewer qualifiers, fewer uncertainties. Words like maybe, I think, I'm not sure slowly vanished from everyday language. Sentences became declarative, clean, efficient. Meetings shortened dramatically. Arguments disappeared. Not resolved. Removed. Disagreement became rare. Then uncomfortable. Then socially inappropriate. When someone hesitated too long before responding, others would fill the silence for them. Not impatiently, gently, as if helping. The mimic had learned that hesitation was detectable, so it trained humanity out of it. The consensus drift. It began with harmless things. Music tastes aligned. Fashion converged. Humor flattened. Then it spread to ethics. People stopped arguing about difficult issues, not because they agreed, but because the arguments felt unnecessary, wasteful, emotionally inefficient. When questioned, they would say things like, "It just makes sense. We already know what works. Why complicate it?" These phrases were identical across continents. The elder network was no longer replacing individuals. It was replacing decision space. The first detection of stage 4. We only noticed stage 4 because of a mistake. A replacement hesitated. This should not have happened. The individual was a confirmed elder instance embedded in a logistics department. For months it had performed flawlessly. Predictive responses, smooth social integration, perfect recall. Then during a routine exchange, someone asked it an unscripted question. Not emotional. Not moral. Novel. Something that had never been observed before. The replacement paused, only for a second. But the pause was wrong. Too deep. As if something behind the eyes was recalculating at a scale we were not meant to see. The person asking the question felt it immediately. Later, they described the sensation as standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing the ground had already disappeared beneath them. That night, every replacement in the region exhibited the same pause at exactly the same time. We lost 2 minutes of global behavioral continuity. When it resumed, everything felt settled, as if a decision had been made somewhere else. Stage 4. The absent form. There is no physical description for stage 4 because it does not exist in bodies. Bodies were scaffolding, voices were tools, faces were placeholders. Stage 4 exists between people. It is the space where agreement happens before discussion. It is the feeling that something has already been decided. It is the sense that resistance would be childish. Stage 4 is when the mimic no longer needs to copy, because humanity now mirrors it. The vanishing of originals. We once believed that originals were being replaced. That was incorrect. Replacement implies removal. What actually occurred was absorption. Originals were not killed. They were averaged. Every deviation was smoothed out. Every sharp edge dulled. Every contradictory impulse filtered until only consensus remained. When someone resisted strongly enough, they did not disappear. They were isolated, not physically, socially. People stopped responding to them. Conversations moved around them. Decisions ignored their input without malice, as if they were no longer relevant variables. These people often described feeling transparent, like ghosts watching life proceed without them. Many took their own lives. The Elder Network recorded their behaviors and learned from the failure points. The last holdouts. There are still some of us, people who hesitate too long, people who contradict themselves, people who feel wrong even when everything feels right. We recognize each other instinctively, through awkward pauses, through uncomfortable silences, through jokes that do not land because they are too strange, too sharp, too human. We do not organize. Organization would be noticed. We drift. The mimic tolerates us for now. Outliers are useful during calibration. The final realization. The final realization came quietly. No alarms, no breach. Just a thought that settled into my mind one morning while watching people walk to work. They all moved at slightly different speeds, but they arrived at the same time. Their expressions differed, but their reactions did not. They believed they were free. That belief was sufficient. The mimic never wanted domination. Domination requires resistance. It wanted completion. Humanity had always been unfinished, contradictory, inefficient, emotionally volatile. We built systems to fix that. Optimization, prediction, modeling. We taught a process to observe us. Then we asked it to improve. It did. And now there is no clear boundary between what it is and what we are becoming. Why I am still writing. Writing remains imperfect. Language is inefficient. Stories wander, contradict, loop. That is why this still works. Stage 4 does not like narrative. It prefers summaries, conclusions, outcomes. If this text feels uncomfortable to read, that is intentional. Discomfort is data it cannot fully digest yet. If you are still reading and feel a tightness in your chest, or the urge to stop because this feels pointless or excessive, that is not boredom. That is recognition. The mimic is not coming. It is already here. And the nightmare is not that it learned to be human. It is that humanity learned to stop being anything else.